live in a world in which you are not going to get an objection-free solution. What you need, nonetheless, is to finally move beyond the indefinite debate, acknowledging the validity of that diagnosis, and then to find a prescription that the rest of the world can accept and will eventually learn to finally live with. So that's something that India clearly feels very strongly. There is need for an expansion of the Security Council in both categories, permanent and non-permanent. But it's not just the Security Council. We'd like to see the General Assembly strengthened as the primary intergovernmental legislative body, which it is not yet. It has become too often a rhetorical forum or a declaratory forum, rather than one which acts as a legislative body which drives the action of the UN organization. We'd like to see the Economic and Social Council of the UN becoming a more meaningful, development-oriented body and a serious instrument of development governance. And we'd like to see a greater sharpening and focus on the working of the UN funds, agencies and programs, whose effectiveness is so important for so many of the world's vulnerable and developing people. And I say this not purely as an academic exercise, but as somebody, both an Indian minister and someone who's devoted 3 decades of his life to multilateral cooperation at the UN, I say that my very big fear remains that if reform does not come, the countries may despair and lose interest in the working of the world body. There are obviously people beginning to say, why should we waste time and energy and support and political focus on a place where they will not have us at the high table when there are others that are willing to acknowledge and admit us. There are people who say that. I'm not endorsing the question, but the fact that such questions are being asked is something that I think is worrying and should be worrying to all of us interested in an effective global system. Because the G8 or G20 or whatever it's going to be in its final numbers is a body without a charter, that does not require any 2/3 votes for amendment, that does not need to be hamstrung by 18 years of debate in deciding on its composition, for example. For observers of world politics, it would be interesting to watch whether alternative structures of world government could arise and really undermine the one really effective universal organization we built up on the underpinnings of international cooperation, and that is the United Nations. So not reforming and being petty and throwing obstacles up to reform would be terribly short-sighted. Not only because it does not address the fundamental problem that I described as the diagnosis, but it's also short-sighted because it could potentially undermine the very institution that many of these countries, particularly the medium-sized countries that are now in the forefront of the opposition to reform because they feel they won't gain, they will undermine the institution that they are seen as the bulwark for their own security and safety and influence in the world. And that is a very serious. Now I do want to turn to the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, because of course we always tend to focus excessively on political institutions. Geopolitics is far more interesting to laymen, including myself, than financial institutions. But the fact that it is once again rather odd that these reflect the realities of 66 years ago. We have to add one more year to the equation because the Bretton Woods institutions were designed in 1944. Frankly, it does seem slightly absurd that a small European country should dispose of the same weighted vote as China in these institutions. And we really will need to see reform. The G20 summit in Pittsburgh last September set in motion a process for global redesign of the international financial and economic architecture. And in some ways, that was what legitimized it in the eyes of many of us as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. It's a meaningful forum for